I've been asked to reflect briefly on two questions. The first is, what can the Northern Ireland experience teach peace building around the world? Having been close to the centre of the Northern Ireland peace process in one shape or form for almost 50 years, I've identified 7 strategic characteristics central to its eventual success. A clear vision of what you're trying to achieve, some idea of how you're going to get there, strong but flexible leadership, flexible timescales, a willingness to listen, a willingness to take calculated risks and the consequences, high-level international support, political and practical. There are also 3 tactical devices. Nothing is agreed until everything's agreed. Constructive ambiguity. When circumstances require it, documents and statements can be drafted in a way that appears to give each side a win. And the receding crunch. Avoid total breakdowns at all costs. Keep the ball in play somehow. When direct rule was introduced to Northern Ireland at the start of 1972, the first priority of the British government was to bring an end to the violence that had broken out 2 years before. The actions of the police and army, often at great cost to themselves, and internment without trial of terrorist suspects, weren't stemming the bloody flow. Indeed, it can be submitted that they were making things even worse. Nor was dialogue working productively between the Secretary of State, William Whitelaw, and the local political parties, and with other community representatives and the Irish government. Something more was needed, and that was dialogue with the enemy. In other words, with the leaderships of the Provisional IRA and their loyalist counterparts. Those early talks, conducted in secret at first, were ultimately unsuccessful, but talking to terrorists, or freedom fighters as some would call them, was to become an important cog in the peace process. The main purpose of such radical dialogue is to let each side explore the other's bottom lines with the absolute objective of bringing violence to an end in circumstances that will ensure its permanence. Inevitably, concessions and compromises were necessary, but these have their limits. And in Northern Ireland, those limits were always consistent with the government's stated objectives, which were the establishment of devolved government on a power-sharing basis, with ministerial posts allocated between the parties on a proportional basis, practical working arrangements between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and between the UK and the Republic, guaranteeing there would be no change to Northern Ireland's position within the UK without the consent of its people. And there was an overarching requirement that the social and economic betterment should be at the centre of everything that we did. There were many twists and turns on the road between the introduction of direct rule and the Good Friday Agreement a quarter of a century later, but these principles were always at its core. In the later stages, the huge amount of political and practical support received from the international community, particularly from the EU and the USA, was crucial. In the time available to me, it's only possible to paint a very broad picture, but in any peace process, the importance of terrorist prisoners and their families can't be overestimated. From an early stage, the British government was pragmatic, ending internment without trial, learning lessons from the hunger strike that claimed the lives of 10 Republican prisoners, and ultimately ensuring that the Good Friday Agreement secured the release of all convicted terrorist prisoners after they'd served a maximum of 2 years imprisonment. But even 23 years later, we're not quite there yet, as the current controversy surrounding the government's legacy proposals, including a virtual amnesty for crimes committed before the Good Friday Agreement, illustrates. I've had hands-on experience of how some of these lessons have been applied to other peace processes, including Colombia and Cameroon, Lebanon and Sri Lanka. Here's an example, ultimately a successful one. I was a member of the International Verification Commission that was established in Spain in 2011 with the objective of ensuring that the ceasefire declared the previous year by the terrorist group ETA became permanent, and that a process of decommissioning of their arms was begun and completed. That ceasefire declaration coincided with an international peace process in San Sebastian, which was attended by a number of significant international figures, including Kofi Annan, Bertie Ahern, Jonathan Powell and Gerry Adams. It was no coincidence that two of my fellow commissioners had first-hand experience of Northern Ireland. One was a former advisor to the President of Sri Lanka. The other had been a senior member of the ANC and then Minister for Intelligence Services in South Africa's post-apartheid government. ETA prisoners were central to all our discussions, although the Spanish government was unhelpful to say the least, on one occasion detaining us in Bilbao and bringing us to Madrid to explain ourselves in front of the High Court. The Basque regional government was quite the opposite, and their Prime Minister and Minister of Justice accompanied us to the Madrid High Court. Eventually, all was well, and in 2017, ETA decommissioned its arsenal on the French side of the border with Spain to ensure there was no repeat of our Madrid experience, and with the full support of the French President. Later, the position of ETA prisoners in Spain began to improve, though the improvements fell well short of what we would like. I realise this is only a snapshot of a massive topic, and I'll be happy to answer questions later, if you have any. The second question I've been asked to address, again briefly, is how is Brexit impacting the peace in Northern Ireland and otherwise the lives of the people here? As this presentation was recorded a little while ago, I'd be wise to qualify my remarks by making the obvious point that in Northern Ireland things can change very quickly. But at the moment I'm confident that the answer to the question is pretty straightforward. Although there have been some street protests and associated violence by loyalists opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, fortunately there's been no loss of life or serious injury. Compared to previous Unionist protests about the actions of British governments in Northern Ireland, the campaign has been relatively minor, and I expect this to continue. I think there are several reasons for this. In the Brexit referendum, 56% of the Northern Ireland electorate voted to stay in the EU. They included a lot of Unionists who enjoyed their EU membership and who accept that a hard border on the island of Ireland is politically and practically unacceptable. Many of those Unionists realise that British governments, particularly Conservative governments, have been unmoved when Unionists have taken to the streets. Indeed, the huge rallies that accompanied the suspension of Stormont in 1972, the Sunningdale and power sharing arrangements in 1973 and 4, and the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985 achieved absolutely nothing but further disenchantment in the corridors of power in London about Northern Ireland and its ultimate future. Also, while there's justifiable concern at a practical level about a border in the Irish Sea, there's fairly widespread belief that ways will be found to ameliorate the difficulties and anomalies associated with the flow of goods and services across it. This realism is also being reinforced by the responsible attitudes of the current leaders of the two main Unionist parties, who, unlike some of their historical predecessors, have called for cool heads and stressed that the only way forward is negotiation and dialogue. Current examples I might suggest of constructive ambiguity and the receding crunch. So all in all, while I personally very much regret Brexit, I believe its consequences for Northern Ireland are all capable of rational solution, and that sooner or later that solution will be found. Thank you.